Welcome to Scared Stories for a Rainy Night. As a reminder, before we begin, there are minimum ads in this entire video, so you can relax, sleep, and listen to the video without interruptions. I really hope you enjoy, and lastly, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you. Before I begin, let me set the record straight. I am not a believer in ghosts or the supernatural. My name is Dr. Lydia Marlowe, a psychologist trained to understand the complexities of the human mind, and I have always relied on reason and evidence. But what happened at Holloway House challenged everything I thought I knew. It all started with an invitation. Professor Elliot Holloway, a renowned historian and an old friend from university, invited me to his ancestral home in the secluded woods of Vermont. He claimed to have discovered something extraordinary and needed my expertise to understand the psychological implications. The drive was long and the autumn leaves painted the landscape in hues of red and gold. As I approached Holloway House, an unsettling chill crept over me. The Victorian mansion loomed against the gray sky, its once majestic facade now worn and tired. Elliot greeted me warmly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Lydia," he said, "I'm glad you're here. There's much to discuss." As I settled in, Elliot wasted no time in explaining his discovery. In the house's attic, he had found an old diary belonging to his great-great-grandmother, Eliza Holloway. The diary detailed a series of bizarre events that occurred in the house over a century ago. The entries spoke of strange noises, whispering voices, and inexplicable occurrences that drove Eliza to the brink of madness. Elliot believed that the house itself was a vessel of dark energy, feeding on the fears and emotions of its inhabitants. Skeptical, I agreed to stay for a few days to conduct my own investigation. I set up recording equipment in key areas of the house and began my observations. The first night was uneventful, but as the clock struck midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the creaking staircase. The sound had come from the library. Books lay scattered across the floor, but there was no sign of an intruder. As I picked up one of the fallen volumes, a chilling draft swept through the room, carrying with it a faint, mournful whisper. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I dismissed it as my imagination. Returning to bed, I struggled to sleep, my mind racing with questions. The following day, I examined the attic, where Elliot had found the diary. Dust motes floated in the stagnant air, and the only light came from a small, grimy window. I scanned the room, noting the peculiar sensation of being watched. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a large, ornate mirror propped against the wall. My reflection stared back at me, but something was off. A shadow lingered behind me, something or someone that wasn't there when I turned around. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. Shaken, I hurried downstairs, determined to find a logical explanation. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. Doors slammed on their own. Disembodied voices echoed through the halls, and strange symbols appeared scratched into the walls. My recordings, however, captured nothing out of the ordinary. Elliot grew increasingly agitated, convinced that the spirits of his ancestors were trying to communicate. I, on the other hand, began to question my own sanity. One evening, as I reviewed my notes in the dim light of the study, I heard a soft sobbing coming from the hallway. Cautiously, I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The cries led me to the basement door, which creaked open as I approached. I hesitated for a moment before descending the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the sobbing intensified. At the bottom, I found an old, dusty phonograph. It was playing a haunting melody, though the needle was unmoving. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a raspy voice that whispered my name. "Lydia, help us." A cold dread settled over me as I realized the voice was not from the phonograph. I spun around, and there she stood, Eliza Holloway, her ghostly form translucent and ethereal. Eliza's eyes pleaded with me, and in that moment I felt a surge of empathy. She pointed to a hidden alcove in the wall, and I understood. With trembling hands, I uncovered a small compartment containing a bundle of letters and an old photograph. The letters revealed a dark family secret. Elliot's ancestors had committed heinous acts, and their spirits were trapped, seeking redemption. The photograph showed Eliza and another man, their faces marked by sorrow. Suddenly, everything clicked. The house was not haunted by malevolent spirits, but by the echoes of past sins. Eliza's spirit lingered, seeking justice and closure. Armed with the truth, I confronted Elliot, who was initially skeptical, but as I presented the evidence, he grew pale, realizing the weight of his family's legacy. Together, we devised a plan to lay the spirits to rest by acknowledging the past and making amends. On the final night, we held a small ceremony in the attic, honoring the lost souls and promising to preserve their memory. As we finished, a gentle warmth enveloped the room, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. Eliza stood beside me, her expression one of gratitude, but her eyes held a secret, a hint of something left unsaid. I returned home, forever changed by my experience at Holloway House. The paranormal phenomena ceased, and Elliot continued his work, committed to honoring his ancestors' memory. Yet, the memory of Eliza's knowing gaze haunted me. It wasn't until I developed the photograph that I realized the truth. The man in the picture bore an uncanny resemblance to Elliot. The twist? Elliot was not just a descendant of the Holloways. He was the reincarnation of Eliza's lost love, destined to complete the cycle and bring peace to the restless spirits of Holloway House. And that, dear listener, is a tale of how the past can reach across time, leaving its mark on the present in ways we can scarcely imagine. I've always hated working the night shift. There's something about the silence of a near-empty office building at 2 a.m. that makes my skin crawl. My name is Danica, and I work as a security guard for a corporate office tower downtown. Tonight was supposed to be like any other night, quiet, boring, and uneventful. But it wasn't. I was doing my usual rounds, walking the hallways and checking the doors. The building's 12 floors are usually dead silent except for the occasional hum of the elevator or the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. But tonight, I kept hearing faint, irregular noises, scratches, footsteps, a door creaking when I knew there was no one else here. I chalked it up to my imagination at first, but then I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. The sound of a child laughing. It was faint, like it was coming from a floor above me. I was on the 6th floor, so I figured it must have been coming from the 7th. A chill ran down my spine. I knew the cleaning crew left hours ago, and there shouldn't be anyone else in the building. But I had a job to do, so I took the stairs up to the 7th floor. As soon as I stepped onto the 7th floor, the air felt heavier, like I was walking through water. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows along the wall. I listened carefully, but the sound of laughter had stopped. I slowly walked down the hallway, shining my flashlight into the empty offices. Everything was in its place, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned a corner and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman dressed in an old-fashioned black dress that looked like something out of the 19th century. Her back was to me, and she was just standing there, perfectly still. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. No response. I called again, louder this time. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You're not supposed to be here." She didn't move. I took a few cautious steps closer, and that's when I noticed something was off. Her hair was matted and tangled, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. A rancid smell hit me, a mix of decay and something metallic, like old blood. My stomach turned. "Ma'am, you need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I reached for my radio, but the static buzzed loudly in my ear. The interference was so strong that it made me wince. I turned the radio off and looked back down the hallway, but she was gone. I blinked, my heart racing. There was no way she could have moved that fast. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, but it was empty. I rushed to the end of the corridor, thinking maybe she had gone into one of the offices, but all the doors were still locked. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I felt like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe this job was finally getting to me. I decided to head back to my station on the first floor. I needed to sit down, take a breath, and clear my head. As I made my way back to the stairs, I heard the laughter again. This time it was louder, closer, and it was definitely coming from a child. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway and that damned flickering light. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. I reached the first floor, panting, and slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I made my way back to the security desk and pulled up the building's security cameras. I scanned through the feeds, but everything seemed normal. No sign of the woman, no sign of any children. Just empty hallways and locked offices. I was about to give up when I noticed something odd on the 7th floor camera. In the far corner of the hallway, there was a faint smudge, like a shadow that didn't belong. I zoomed in, and my blood ran cold. It was the woman. She was standing just outside the frame, her head slightly turned, as if she was looking directly at the camera. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I watched in horror as she slowly raised her hand and pointed directly at the camera. Directly at me. The feed cut to static, and my radio crackled to life with that same childlike laughter, now mixed with a low, guttural growl. I jumped to my feet, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. As I reached for the door handle, the lights went out. The entire building was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it slipped from my grasp and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls and filling the air with a deafening noise. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and my blood turned to ice. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just darkness and that overpowering stench of decay. The laughter was louder now, all around me, filling the air with a chilling, echoing sound. I backed away, my hands shaking, and slammed into the door. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers numb and uncooperative. Finally, the door clicked open, and I stumbled out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was outside, under the bright streetlights. I doubled over, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked back at the building, half expecting to see her standing in the window, watching me. But the windows were dark, empty, just like they were supposed to be. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of too many night shifts and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew it was real. I quit my job the next morning. I never went back to that building. A week later, I got a call from my former supervisor. They found something strange on the 7th floor. a door that hadn't been there before. It was an old wooden door, rotting and covered in scratches. They pried it open and found a small room, empty except for a single dusty chair facing the wall. But that wasn't the worst part. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings, each one about a different missing person, all from the late 1800s. At the center of the wall was a black and white photograph of a woman in a black dress, her eyes dark and empty, and her mouth twisted into that same haunting smile. They tried to ask me if I knew anything, but I hung up the phone. I didn't want to hear anymore. I didn't need to. I knew what I saw, and I knew that whatever was in that building wasn't human. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear that laughter, echoing somewhere far off in the distance, getting closer every time. It's Tuesday, September 3rd, 2023. I'm Lila, a freelance writer, and I've just moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, almost too good to be true, but I figured it was because the place needed some TLC. I was wrong. The first night I heard it, a soft whisper, like dry leaves rustling, coming from the walls. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe mice. I've never been afraid of mice. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They started to sound like words, like voices. And that's when I started to feel afraid. I tried to drown them out with music, with the TV, even with white noise apps on my phone. But the whispers were always there. Always just loud enough to be heard over whatever I tried to use to block them out. They were starting to drive me crazy. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a hammer and started banging on the walls, screaming at the voices to shut up. I must have looked like a mad woman, but I didn't care. I just wanted the noise to stop. And then, suddenly, it did. The whispers stopped, and there was a silence so profound it was almost deafening. I slid down the wall, relieved, but also strangely unsettled. That's when I noticed the crack in the plaster, a thin line that hadn't been there before. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed against the wall, I felt something shift. The wall gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small leather-bound book. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle, and it was filled with names. Hundreds of names, all written in the same neat, precise handwriting. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a growing sense of unease. Some of the names had dates next to them, dates that went back decades. And then, on the last page, I saw my own name, Lila Harper, with today's date written next to it. I dropped the book, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when the whispers started again. But this time, they were different. This time, they were saying my name. Lila, they whispered. Lila, we've been waiting for you. I stumbled back, terror gripping me. And then, the unthinkable happened. The walls started to move. The patterns on the wallpaper shifted, morphing into faces. Hundreds of faces, all staring at me, all whispering my name. I screamed, turning to run, but the door was blocked. The faces were everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, even in the ceiling. I was trapped, and that's when I realized the truth. The house wasn't haunted, it was alive, and it had been waiting for me. I'm still here, in the house. I can't leave. The faces won't let me. They whisper to me, day and night, telling me their stories, their secrets. I write them down in the book. I add their names to the list. And I wait, because sooner or later someone else will move in, and then maybe, just maybe, the house will let me go. So, if you're watching this, If you're thinking about moving into an old house, be careful. Listen to the whispers, because you never know what secrets they might be trying to tell you. And remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night aren't just in your imagination. Sometimes they're right there in the walls, waiting for you to listen. My name is Amelia Gray, and I'm a paranormal investigator. I've spent years exploring the most haunted locations, but nothing could have prepared me for the horrors I faced in my own home in the quiet town of Willow Creek. It was a chilly autumn evening, October 15th, 2022, when I moved into my new home, a beautiful century-old Victorian house on Elm Street. The realtor had warned me about the house's dark history, but I was skeptical. I had always been drawn to the supernatural, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to investigate. The first few days were uneventful, but I began to notice strange noises at night. Creaks, groans, and faint whispers. I set up my equipment hoping to capture some evidence of the paranormal activity. That's when I started to feel a presence around me. A cold, malevolent energy that seemed to be watching my every move. One night, I woke up to the sound of my own voice, whispering, "Get out," in a tone that sent shivers down my spine. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the house. I started to research the history of the property, scouring through old records and talking to the locals. That's when I discovered the dark secret of Willow Creek. In the 1950s, a family of 4 had lived in this very house. The father, a reclusive and troubled man, had been accused of murdering his wife and children. The police had found no evidence, but the townspeople were convinced of his guilt. The father had disappeared, leaving behind a trail of mystery and terror. As I dug deeper, I became convinced that the malevolent energy in my home was the spirit of the accused father. I set up a Ouija board, hoping to communicate with him, but what I got was something entirely different. The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a message that made my blood run cold. "I am not the killer. You are." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I was plunged into darkness. I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the floor above. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. I was the descendant of the real killer, the one who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The spirit in my home was not the father, but the vengeful spirit of his murdered family. As I sit here recording this video, I can feel the weight of my ancestors' guilt bearing down on me. I know that I'll never be able to escape the darkness that haunts this house, and that I'll be forever trapped in this living nightmare. If you're watching this, beware of the secrets that your own home may hold. The horrors that I've faced are a reminder that the past is always closer than we think, and that the truth can be more terrifying than any fiction. I moved into the old Victorian house on Cedar Street just 3 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to finally call my own after years of renting tiny apartments. The house was a bit of a fixer-upper, sure, but the price was right, and as a freelance writer, I needed the solitude to focus on my work. My name is Lisa Gardner. I'm 32, and I write horror stories for a living, though nothing I've written could prepare me for what happened in that house. It began subtly. Things would go missing. Small things, like a pen or a spoon. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness, the kind that happens when you're buried deep in a manuscript. But then the noises started. It was late one night when I first heard it, a faint creaking from above. I was in my office on the second floor, typing away, when the sound broke the silence. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, moving slowly across the attic above me. I told myself it was just the house settling, old wood groaning in the night. But the sounds were too deliberate, too purposeful. Footsteps, unmistakably. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, flashlight in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder the higher I went, and as I reached the attic door, I hesitated. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to listen. Nothing, just silence. When I opened the door, the attic was exactly as I'd left it, cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dust. I felt foolish, scared by a house that was just settling into the cold night air. But as I turned to go back downstairs, I noticed something odd. A small round spot on the dusty floor, like a footprint. My breath hitched. I hadn't stepped there. I decided not to think about it too much. I was already behind on my deadlines, and my editor was breathing down my neck. But the next night, it happened again, only this time the footsteps were louder, closer. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and marched back up to the attic, half convinced I'd find some vagrant hiding up there. Nothing, just the same empty, dusty room. But now there were more footprints, scattered haphazardly across the floor, each one smudged and vague like they were made by someone dragging their feet. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone had been up there. I called the police, and they did a sweep of the house. They assured me there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone living up there. They left, telling me to call if I heard anything else. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house around me. Every creak, every groan of the wood set my nerves on edge. The footsteps returned the following night, louder than before. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth, almost angrily. I couldn't bring myself to go up there again. I just sat on the stairs, clutching the knife, listening. As the weeks went on, the footsteps became a regular occurrence, always at the same time. 2:14 a.m., like clockwork. It was as if whoever or whatever was up there was trying to tell me something. I was losing sleep, my work was suffering, and I started to dread the nights. I'd begun leaving all the lights on, hoping that maybe the brightness would keep the noises at bay, but it didn't. Then, one night, I heard something different. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. I strained to hear, holding my breath as I pressed my ear against the attic door. "Help me!" I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice was weak, raspy, like it hadn't been used in a long time. I knew then that I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go up there to confront whatever was in my attic. I called my friend Alex, the only person I trusted to believe me. He was skeptical, of course, but agreed to come over. We armed ourselves with flashlights and kitchen knives, laughable weapons against whatever we might find, but it was better than nothing. We climbed the stairs together, Alex leading the way. As we reached the attic, the air turned icy. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could feel Alex tense beside me. The footprints were there, clearer now, like they'd been made recently. We shone our flashlights around the room, illuminating the cobwebs and forgotten relics of the past. That's when we saw it. A hatch in the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind an old armoire. I hadn't noticed it before. It was small, just big enough for a person to crawl through. My skin prickled. This was it. This was where the noise was coming from. Alex went first, squeezing through the hatch while I held my breath, every muscle in my body on edge. He shone his flashlight inside, illuminating a small, hidden crawl space. That's when he froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Lisa, you need to see this." I climbed through after him, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. In the corner of the crawl space there was a figure, small, hunched, and impossibly thin. At first I thought it was a mannequin, dressed in tattered clothes. But then I saw its eyes, hollow, sunken eyes that stared blankly ahead. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a man, gaunt, emaciated, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He was clutching something in his hand, something he held up to us with a trembling skeletal arm, a notebook. I reached out and took it, my hands shaking. The pages were filled with cramped, hurried writing, like he'd been scribbling in a frenzy. I flipped through the pages, reading snippets of his frantic scrawl. Trapped. Can't get out. Footsteps. Always footsteps. He's here. I hear him every night. He won't let me leave. Please, if you find this, help me. The words trailed off into incoherent scribbles, like he'd been too weak to continue. I looked back at the man, but his eyes were vacant. He was long dead. I didn't understand. Who was he writing about? Who was he? And then it hit me, the man wasn't the one making the footsteps. He was hiding from them. We left the house that night, unable to stay another minute. I called the police, told them everything. They found the man's body, confirmed he'd been up there for months, maybe even years, but they never found any evidence of someone else being in the house. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there, not with the knowledge of what I'd seen. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I still hear it, the faint creaking of footsteps, like someone pacing in the attic. And I know, deep down, that whoever he was hiding from, he's still out there. My name is Jessica, and I never considered myself easily scared. I'm a freelance digital marketer, and I work from home, which is a renovated Victorian house I inherited from my grandmother. It's a beautiful, albeit old, structure with creaky floors, tall windows, and an attic that I'd only visited once when I moved in 3 years ago. The attic was filled with dusty, forgotten items, broken furniture, stacks of old books, and a musty smell that made my nose wrinkle. I decided then that I'd keep the door shut and never venture up there again. But, as it turned out, the attic wasn't keen on being ignored. It started on a Tuesday evening around 10 p.m. I was working late on a deadline when I heard it, a faint creaking noise, like footsteps, directly above me. I froze, staring up at the ceiling of my office. It was an old house, and I'd grown accustomed to the usual sounds, the groaning of wooden beams or the occasional rustles of the wind against the windows. But this was different, rhythmic, deliberate. I convinced myself it was nothing, perhaps an animal that had found its way inside. But as days passed, the noises persisted. Sometimes they were soft, barely audible. Other times, it sounded as if someone was pacing back and forth with slow, heavy steps. I could never catch the noise when I stood directly under the attic entrance, almost like it knew I was listening. The sounds began to escalate. At night, when the house was dead silent, I could hear a faint whispering. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, the remnants of exhaustion and stress. But soon, the whispers grew louder, more coherent, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I couldn't make out any words, only that low, sibilant sound that made my skin crawl. One night, the whispers were so clear I could almost understand them. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the soft, insistent murmur. I felt a chill down my spine. I had the unsettling feeling that whatever was up there was talking about me. I tried to ignore it, to distract myself with work, music, anything. but the noises got worse. They seemed to follow me from room to room, always overhead. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. I could hear soft scratching noises, like nails dragging across wood. I checked the attic door, and it was locked, just as I had left it. I tried to laugh it off with friends, blaming my overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, after a particularly long day, I heard a loud thud coming from above. It was followed by frantic shuffling. I jumped out of my chair, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and decided enough was enough. I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge. I was going to find out what was in the attic and deal with it once and for all. The staircase to the attic was narrow and steep. I hadn't been up there since the day I moved in. My footsteps echoed as I ascended, the old wood creaking under my weight. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I took a deep breath, twisted the knob, and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, stale, like something had been rotting for years. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, sweeping the beam across the cluttered space. There was nothing but the same old boxes and broken furniture. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the far corner of the attic, just beyond the reach of the light, was a mirror. It was an antique, with an ornate gilded frame covered in dust. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. I walked closer, feeling an inexplicable pull towards it. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the mirror, a shadow flitting behind me. I spun around, but the attic was empty. I turned back to the mirror, leaning in closer. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection, just behind me, stood a figure. It was faint, almost transparent, but unmistakably human. A woman with dark eyes and a twisted smile. She wasn't looking at me, though. She was looking down at something in her hand, a small, ornate locket. I recognized it instantly. It was the same locket I had found in my grandmother's old jewelry box, the one I'd been wearing since I moved in. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the light, my heart pounding. When I finally got it back on, the mirror was empty. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. I could still feel her eyes on me. That twisted smile etched into my mind. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, too scared to go back to my bedroom. The next morning, I called a friend who was a contractor, asking him to check the attic for any signs of animals or wiring issues. He agreed, though he seemed skeptical. When he arrived, I watched him climb the stairs, holding my breath. He was up there for what felt like hours. Finally, he came down, wiping dust from his hands. "There's nothing up there, Jess," he said, shrugging. "No animals, no loose wiring, just a bunch of old junk. And that mirror, it's beautiful, but it's just a mirror. You're sure you didn't see anything?" I nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I wasn't sure I believed myself. He left, and I was alone again, staring at the locked attic door. I decided to take down the mirror, put it in the basement, and forget about it. But when I went back up, the mirror was gone. I never heard the whispers again after that, but sometimes late at night, I still feel like I'm being watched. And every so often, when I pass by the attic door, I hear the faintest sound of footsteps above, pacing back and forth, as if waiting for something or someone. I'm Thomas, and tonight I want to share something that happened to me. It's a story that's haunted me for years, and despite my best efforts, I've never quite been able to shake it. I hope you can handle a little suspense, because this is no ordinary tale. It all began a few years ago. I was a software engineer, working from home in a cozy suburban house I had just bought. The house was old, Victorian style, with creaky floors and rooms that seemed to shift in the corners of your vision. I loved the character of it, though. Little did I know, I was about to learn just how much character it truly had. It was a late autumn evening. The wind howled outside and the leaves rattled against the windows like whispers. I was working late, trying to fix a bug in a crucial project. My office was on the second floor, and as night fell, I was bathed in the eerie glow of my desk lamp. I'd always found the house a bit unsettling at night, but nothing had ever happened that could explain why. However, that night, something was different. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly. My breath misted in the air, and I noticed a strange chill in my office. I brushed it off as an issue with the old heating system and continued working. But then I heard a soft thud, like something heavy falling. I froze, listening intently. The sound came from downstairs. I decided to investigate, though I really didn't want to. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over me. The house was silent, except for the creaking of the wooden stairs beneath my feet. I reached the ground floor and noticed that the living room was in disarray. The furniture had been moved slightly, as if someone had been searching for something. My heart raced, but I reassured myself it was just my imagination. I turned back to head upstairs when I noticed something peculiar. The door to the basement, which I usually kept locked, was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it earlier. Hesitantly, I approached the door and peered into the darkness below. The basement light was off, and I couldn't see a thing. Driven by curiosity and a sense of duty to check my home, I made my way down the creaky steps. The basement was cold and damp, and I shivered as I flicked on the light. It revealed old boxes and dusty furniture, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. A door I'd never noticed before, tucked away behind a pile of boxes. The door was painted a deep, unsettling shade of red. I had never seen it before. As I approached, my skin crawled. I reached for the handle, and it turned easily, revealing a small, cluttered room. My heart pounded in my chest. Inside, there were old photographs scattered across the floor, faded, yellowed with age. They depicted a family that looked oddly familiar, standing in front of what seemed to be this very house. The family looked happy, but there was something unsettling about their expressions. In the center of the room was an old dusty rocking chair. As I stepped forward, it began to rock gently, though there was no breeze or movement to cause it. My hands trembled as I picked up one of the photographs, and that's when I saw it. In the background of one of the photos was a figure, a dark silhouette standing just outside the frame. My blood ran cold as I realized that the figure seemed to be watching the family. I shivered and set the photo down, turning to leave. That's when I noticed the words scrawled on the wall in what looked like old, peeling paint. They never leave. I stumbled back, up the stairs, my heart racing. I locked the basement door and returned to my office, where I tried to shake off the fear. I didn't sleep that night, and the next day, I called a local historian to learn more about the house. It turned out that the house had a dark history. The family in the photographs had been the original owners, and they had mysteriously disappeared one night many years ago. The legend was that they were taken by something malevolent, and the house had never been the same since. The twist? The historian told me that there had been rumors of a hidden room in the basement, a place where the spirits of those who had disappeared were said to linger, trapped in a place of eternal darkness. To this day, I can't explain the rocking chair or the cold that night, but I've never gone back into that red room. I don't think I ever will. And as for the house, I eventually sold it. But every time I pass by, I can't help but shudder, thinking of that eerie red room and the whispers that seem to linger in the corners of my mind. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. And remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't quite explain. I never believed in ghosts, not until I moved into Halcyon House. My name is Alara Finch, an illustrator by trade, drawn to the old Victorian estate by its promise of solitude and inspiration. The house sat at the edge of the small town of Eldergrove, shrouded in mist and mystery, its darkened windows like empty eyes watching over the dense forest behind it. It was the perfect place to escape, or so I thought. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a shiver trailed down my spine, but I dismissed it as nothing more than the draft from the cracked window panes. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days sketching in the sunlit study, and my evenings curled up by the fireplace, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves. Yet, there was a certain chill to the air, a whisper of something unseen lurking just beyond the corner of my eye. It began with small things. My pencils would vanish, only to reappear in odd places like the kitchen or the bathroom. Doors creaked open on their own, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed at odd hours, though it hadn't been wound in years. One night, as I lay in bed, the familiar creaking of the floorboards echoed down the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound drew closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting for the handle to turn, but the silence stretched on until I finally drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I found a series of strange sketches on my desk. They were rough, almost frantic drawings of shadowy figures, their eyes dark voids. I didn't remember drawing them, but my charcoal-stained fingers told a different story. Determined to uncover the truth, I spent the day researching the history of Halcyon House. I discovered that it once belonged to a recluse named Gideon Halcyon, an artist plagued by madness and obsession. According to local legend, Gideon disappeared one night, leaving behind only his unfinished paintings and a house full of secrets. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it again, the creaking footsteps, this time accompanied by the soft rasp of a whisper. I could make out the words, faint and chilling. "Finish it." Driven by a strange compulsion, I took up my charcoal and began to draw. The shadows seemed to guide my hand, forming a picture of the house, but not as it was now. It was alive, vibrant, with people I didn't recognize moving through its rooms. Suddenly, the room grew cold and the shadows deepened. The figures in my sketch turned to face me, their eyes no longer voids but mirrors reflecting my own fear. I dropped the charcoal, stumbling back as the shadows spilled from the page, coalescing into a form that was all too real. It was Gideon Halcyon, or what was left of him, his face twisted in anguish. His voice echoed in my mind, a plea wrapped in desperation. Finish what I could not. In a moment of clarity, I understood. Gideon's madness was his unfinished masterpiece, a painting that could capture the souls of the house's inhabitants. He hadn't disappeared, he was trapped, and now it was trying to claim me too. With trembling hands, I took up the brush, determined to end the cycle. I painted furiously, the brush strokes guided by something beyond my understanding. As I completed the final stroke, A blinding light filled the room, and the shadows screamed. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, the house was still. The oppressive weight had lifted, and the air felt lighter, as if a breath had been held for too long and finally released. I left Halcyon House the next day. My sketches of the shadowy figures left behind, buried under layers of dust and time. As I crossed the threshold for the last time, I glanced back at the old estate. For a moment, I thought I saw a familiar figure standing in the window, watching me with a serene smile. Gideon was free, and so was I. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear the whisper, "Finish it." The clock in my grandmother's old house ticks louder at night. It's not a rhythmic sound like most clocks. It's erratic and disjointed, like a heartbeat gone awry. I've been staying here for a few days to sort through her belongings after she passed. The house, built in the late 1800s, creaks with the weight of its history. The walls seem to whisper secrets in the dead of night, secrets I've been trying desperately to ignore. The first night I stayed here, I heard it, a faint whispering in the darkness, like someone was trying to speak through a thick fog. I convinced myself it was the wind or the old pipes. The second night, the whispers turned to a soft murmur that persisted, even though the house was as still as a tomb. I decided it was my overactive imagination, fueled by exhaustion and stress. Tonight, however, things felt different. I had just finished going through an old trunk in the attic when I found a peculiar object, a small, ornate box covered in intricate carvings. It was locked, and there was no key in sight. I'd been using the attic as my temporary storage room, and I couldn't recall ever seeing the box before. My grandmother was a collector of oddities and antiques, but this piece was unlike anything I had encountered in her collection. After I set the box aside, the house seemed to grow colder. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to sleep, but the whispers returned. They were more insistent now, like someone was trying to communicate something urgent. The whispers formed indistinct words, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, a figment of my tired mind. Around midnight, I heard the distinct sound of the attic door creaking open. I froze. The door was heavy, and the sound was unmistakable. I glanced at the clock. Its hands seemed to move erratically, as if mocking me. Mustering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic. The stairs groaned under my weight. When I reached the top, I saw that the attic door was indeed ajar. The air was frigid, and the box was now sitting in the center of the room, directly under the lone, dusty beam of light from the bulb. I hadn't moved it. I was certain of that. With trembling hands, I approached the box. The carvings seemed to shift subtly in the dim light, as if the patterns were alive. The whispers grew louder, clearer. I could make out fragmented words. Help, escape, truth. My heart raced. I reached out and tried to open the box, but it remained stubbornly locked. I searched the attic for a key, finding nothing but old furniture and forgotten relics. The murmuring grew frantic, almost pleading. I was on the verge of panic when I noticed something odd. A small, old photograph lying on the floor near the box. I picked it up. It was a faded black and white image of a young woman, my grandmother, standing next to a man whose face was obscured. Behind them was the very same attic, and there was an eerie resemblance to the box I held. The woman's eyes in the photo seemed to follow me with a desperate intensity. A sudden chill made me shiver. The whispers now turned into a loud cacophony, and I heard a distinct voice say, "Find the key." I rushed to the trunk I had been sorting through earlier. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I searched. I found a small rusted key buried beneath some old letters. My breath came in ragged gasps as I raced back to the box. The key fit perfectly. The box opened with a creak, revealing an old journal bound in cracked leather. I flipped through it quickly. The pages were filled with my grandmother's neat handwriting, detailing her investigations into paranormal phenomena, including a section about the very house I was standing in. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. The entity that resides here is malevolent. It demands a sacrifice to be appeased. I can hear it now, calling for someone to take my place. I fear it will not let me leave. As I read those chilling words, the house seemed to come alive. The whispers grew into anguished screams. The walls began to pulse as if breathing. I felt an icy hand on my shoulder and spun around to find no one. Then I saw it. A shadow, dark and shifting, emerging from the corner of the room. It seemed to be forming into a recognizable shape, a mirror image of the photograph I had seen, the man with the obscured face. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The man in the photo was not just an old acquaintance, but something far more sinister. It was a being trapped within the house, and it had been waiting for someone to discover the journal and complete its dark ritual. I ran down the stairs, the house echoing with the screams of the unseen entity. I stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I looked back at the house, the windows dark and foreboding, and saw the shadowy figure watching from the attic window. In my rush to escape, I realized the twist of the entire ordeal. The house had been waiting for me, the last heir to the family, to finally unlock its dark secrets. As I drove away, I knew that the house would remain a place of eternal darkness, and I was the one who had released it. The whispers were gone, but their echoes would haunt me forever. I'd always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. My name is Larry Morrison, and I work as a real estate agent in a sleepy town where houses change hands more often than people. Last month, I came across a listing that would turn my entire world upside down. It was an old Victorian house on the edge of town, left to rot after its last occupant vanished nearly a decade ago. It had a reputation, a chilling one. Most agents avoided it like the plague, but I was eager for a challenge. It was the kind of property that could make or break a career. I decided to take a closer look one evening. The listing photos were hauntingly beautiful, dusty chandeliers, cobwebbed corners, and grand staircases. In person, the house was even more imposing. Its faded paint and overgrown garden gave it an air of abandonment and neglect. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and secrets. I walked through the creaky rooms, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls, once vibrant, were now peeling and gray. It felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to discover something it had been hiding. As I moved through the house, a strange sensation crept over me, a feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild, fueled by the eerie atmosphere, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the place. The basement door was locked, but it wasn't particularly secure. I managed to pry it open with a crowbar. The stairs led down into pitch darkness, and as I descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath misted in front of me, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. It looked like a storage room abandoned in haste. Amidst the junk, I found an old trunk covered in dust. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were old photographs and letters, more like relics than personal items. I picked up one of the photos, which showed a young woman smiling in front of the house. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place where I'd seen her before. The letters were written in a shaky hand, detailing someone's descent into madness, their growing fear of something they couldn't quite explain. One letter stood out. It was addressed to Evelyn, begging her to leave, to get out before it was too late. It mentioned the presence and how the house was not just a home, but a trap. The writer's final plea was to find a way to escape the malevolent force that had taken over the house. Just as I was about to put everything back, I heard a noise behind me, a soft, shuffling sound. My heart raced as I turned around, but the basement was empty. I took a deep breath, dismissing it as a result of my nerves. I left the house that night with a sense of unease. The next morning, I returned to gather more information about the property. The town's records were strangely sparse about the house's history. What was supposed to be a quick consultation turned into a day-long investigation into the house's dark past. It turns out the last occupant was a woman named Evelyn, one and the same from the photo. She had disappeared without a trace. The local legend suggested she had gone mad, convinced that something in the house was out to get her. I tried to dismiss the stories as superstition, but the house had left an impression on me. I decided to keep the house on the market, but no one seemed interested. It remained on my list, a lingering reminder of that night. Then, last week, something strange happened. I received a call from a prospective buyer. The voice was soft, almost hesitant. They wanted to see the house immediately. The name they gave me was Evelyn Harris. I arranged the viewing and arrived at the house to find a woman who looked exactly like the Evelyn in the photograph. Same face, same eyes, but something was off. Her presence was unnervingly calm, as though she were already at home. She walked through the house with a slow, deliberate pace. When she reached the basement, she turned to me with a knowing look. "You don't need to worry about me," she said softly. "I've been waiting for this." As she descended into the basement, the door creaked shut behind her. I tried to open it, but it was locked from the other side. Panic surged through me, and I called for help, but no one came. The police arrived hours later, but there was no sign of Evelyn. The basement was empty, except for the old trunk I had opened weeks before. Everything inside was gone. In the weeks that followed, the house was taken off the market, and I was left with unanswered questions and a chilling memory. The last tenant had returned, and with her, perhaps, something else. They say the dead don't tell tales, but sometimes they leave messages for those willing to listen. As for me, I've learned that some houses are better left unsold. The last tenant had made sure of that. The past has a way of catching up with us. Sometimes it's best to leave some doors unopened. Until next time, remember, some houses have a story that's better left untold.